They say the hardest part of betrayal isn't the lie itself. It's the moment you realize every kiss, every promise, every whispered "I love you" was part of the con. My name is Ava McDowell, and I learned that lesson at 3 in the morning when my entire world collapsed with a single phone call. That night, the house was still. The suburban street outside their home in Boulder, Colorado, was buried under fresh snow, the kind that muffles the world into silence. Ava sat upright in bed when the phone rang, heart pounding before she even picked up. On the other end was Hadley Chambers, her husband's longtime business partner. His voice cracked, wet with rehearsed tears. "There's been an accident," he stammered. "Connor's plane went down outside of Santa Fe. They're saying no survivors." Ava felt the phone slide from her grip. Her knees buckled against the edge of the bed. Somewhere in the background she could hear Hadley's voice droning on about arrangements and identification, but her ears roared with a single truth. Her husband of 8 years, Connor McDowell, was gone. She remembered kissing him goodbye just the day before. He smelled faintly of cedar cologne, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile so steady. He told her he'd call after he landed, the same way he always did, but no call had ever come. Now she knew why. By sunrise, Ava's home was filled with casseroles, flowers, and whispered pity. Neighbors from the cul-de-sac stopped by with hugs that felt too tight, with eyes that studied her like a broken animal. They said all the usual things. "He adored you, you two were perfect together. What will you do now?" Ava could barely stand upright, under the weight of their words. But the real collapse came the next morning, when she walked into First Mountain Bank to access their accounts. She wore her black wool coat, her hair still damp from the shower, face hollow with grief. She signed her name on the withdrawal slip with a shaking hand. The teller typed, then frowned. "Mrs. McDowell," she said carefully. "These accounts have been closed." Ava blinked. "Closed? That's impossible. These are our joint savings. Our retirement funds." The teller lowered her voice. "Your husband transferred the balances yesterday. Wire transfers, multiple destinations, authorized under his signature. Hours before," she hesitated. "Before his flight." The room spun. Ava staggered back against the counter, aware of the eyes of customers in line. She felt their stares prickling her skin, as if the whole town suddenly knew she'd been duped. "Would you like to see the authorization forms?" the teller asked gently. Ava nodded, though her vision blurred with tears. She saw his signature, Connor's precise, slanted handwriting. Her husband hadn't just left her widowed, he'd left her penniless. The humiliation spread like wildfire. Within days she learned the house deed had been quietly transferred months earlier to a shell company. The safe deposit box they'd once used for family keepsakes was emptied. Every trace of financial security she thought they shared had been stripped clean. At the memorial service, whispers curled around her pew, like smoke. "She didn't know," someone murmured. "How could she be so blind?" another whispered. "Maybe the marriage wasn't as perfect as it looked." Ava's face burned as if every guest were laughing at her. To them she wasn't just a grieving widow, she was a fool. A woman who handed her life to a man who played her like a fiddle. When the pastor closed the service, she walked out into the winter wind with her arms wrapped around herself, her black heels crunching against the ice. All she could hear was the word "naive" echoing in her head. Her humiliation only deepened when the insurance adjuster called weeks later. Connor's life insurance claim was denied. Too many irregularities around his death. Fraud red flags. Instead of the payout that might have steadied her life, she received a curt letter suggesting further investigation. The world she thought she knew had been razed in a matter of days. No husband, no home, no savings. And the cruelest cut of all, the knowledge that everyone around her believed she had been living in a dream, too stupid to see the nightmare forming beneath her feet. Ava McDowell went to bed each night, clutching the corner of the quilt Connor's mother had stitched as a wedding gift, her tears soaking into the faded fabric. She tried to recall which part of her life had been real. Was it the laughter in the kitchen when they cooked together? The weekends away in Aspen? The way he'd whisper forever against her ear? Or had all of it been a performance staged by a man already plotting his escape? She didn't know yet, but one truth carved itself into her chest. Deeper than grief itself, the man she buried was never hers to begin with. And the humiliation of that realization, of being the last to know, of standing alone while the world pitied her, was only the beginning. Grief might have been enough on its own. But grief laced with betrayal is poison. it seeps into every corner of your life, until even breathing feels like failure. For Ava McDowell, the days after Connor's death became a slow-motion collapse. At first, she clung to the hope that the bank's error could be explained. But each meeting, each official document, pulled another thread from the fabric of her life until she was left holding scraps. The investigators came first. A detective named Fletcher Hull sat across from her in the kitchen of her now half-empty home, a notepad resting on the scarred oak table. His questions were calm, clinical. "Mrs. McDowell, do you know why there are no FAA records of your husband booking that flight?" Ava blinked. "What do you mean?" "He told me he was flying to Santa Fe for meetings. His partner called me at 3 a.m. Fletcher slid a paper across the table. It was a passenger manifest. Her husband's name wasn't on it. In fact, no such flight had been scheduled at all. Confusion curdled into horror. If Connor never boarded a plane, where had he gone? Piece by piece, the truth surfaced like bones in shallow soil. Surveillance footage showed him entering a storage unit on the edge of town weeks before. Receipts tied him to survival gear, burner phones, and crypto wallets. Bank logs revealed transfers into offshore accounts. And the man who had called Ava weeping, his best friend, Hadley Chambers. Records proved he wasn't even in Colorado that night. He was across the Atlantic, wiring funds in Zurich. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theater. A stage play designed to strip her bare. The fallout was brutal. By spring, the bank repossessed her home, technically owned by that shell company Connor had slipped it into. The neighbors watched as movers carried out her furniture piece by piece. Children pedaled their bikes in slow circles, whispering about the widow who lost everything. When Ava filed for the life insurance claim, the rejection came cold and absolute. Claim denied due to inconsistencies surrounding the insured's death. She could almost hear the smirk of the faceless adjuster, who stamped that denial. Humiliation turned to despair. She stopped grocery shopping, stopped paying bills. The refrigerator hummed with only half-empty cartons of milk and wilting lettuce. Days blurred into nights where she lay on the living room floor, staring at the ceiling fan, waiting for exhaustion to knock her unconscious. Her students noticed first. Ava had taught kindergarten at Maplewood Elementary for 7 years, but now her smile looked painted on, her patience paper-thin. One afternoon, a little girl tugged her sleeve and whispered, "Miss McDowell, why are your eyes always red?" Ava fled to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and cried until her chest ached. Her younger brother, Roy McDowell, finally moved in. He cooked simple meals, scrambled eggs, boxed macaroni and shoved plates into her hands until she ate. "You're not going down like this," he said, his voice hoarse with worry. Roy was the one who insisted on therapy. Ava resisted at first, convinced no stranger could stitch a wound carved this deep. But after weeks of silence, she gave in. That's how she met Dr. Catalina Stone, a trauma therapist with steady eyes, and a voice like gravel smoothed by years of listening. "Tell me about Connor," Catalina urged in their first session. Ava poured out the story. The whirlwind courtship, the romantic trips, the way Connor insisted on handling every bill, every account, every decision. Catalina nodded slowly. "Love bombing," she said at last. "Control masked as care. He built the illusion of security so you wouldn't notice the cage." The word hit like a hammer. A cage. That's what her marriage had been, not a partnership, but a con designed to funnel her life into his escape hatch. For the first time, Ava stopped weeping for what she lost, and started seething at what he'd stolen. Not just the money, but the years of devotion, the trust, the very marrow of her identity. Still, anger alone couldn't stop the freefall. Her credit score cratered. Bill collectors circled like vultures. At the grocery store, her card was declined in front of a line of strangers. She stood frozen as the cashier announced, "Do you have another form of payment?" Her face flamed crimson, while a woman behind her sighed loudly, muttering about people who can't manage their money. Ava walked out with empty hands, her humiliation louder than the hollow growl in her stomach. At night she replayed Hadley's voice on the phone. The quiver, the sniffles, the fake grief. She replayed Connor's smile, wondering how many times he'd kissed her while thinking of escape routes. And every replay drove home the truth. Her husband hadn't died. He had vanished. Alive, rich and free, while she was left to drown in the wreckage. She started to whisper it to herself before sleep. "I wasn't a widow, I was a mark." That sentence became the pivot point. The unraveling was nearly complete. But buried under the humiliation and loss, something new began to smolder, a seed of fury, and the faintest spark of resolve. Because Ava McDowell wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. Her students noticed first. Ava had taught kindergarten at Maplewood Elementary for 7 years, but now her smile looked painted on, her patience paper-thin. One afternoon, a little girl tugged her sleeve and whispered, "Miss McDowell, why are your eyes always red?" Ava fled to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and cried until her chest ached. Her younger brother, Roy McDowell, finally moved in. He cooked simple meals, scrambled eggs, boxed macaroni and shoved plates into her hands until she ate. "You're not going down like this," he said, his voice hoarse with worry. Roy was the one who insisted on therapy. Ava resisted at first, convinced no stranger could stitch a wound carved this deep. But after weeks of silence, she gave in. That's how she met Dr. Catalina Stone, a trauma therapist with steady eyes, and a voice like gravel smoothed by years of listening. "Tell me about Connor," Catalina urged in their first session. Ava poured out the story. The whirlwind courtship, the romantic trips, the way Connor insisted on handling every bill, every account, every decision. Catalina nodded slowly. "Love bombing," she said at last. "Control masked as care. He built the illusion of security so you wouldn't notice the cage." The word hit like a hammer. A cage. That's what her marriage had been, not a partnership, but a con designed to funnel her life into his escape hatch. For the first time, Ava stopped weeping for what she lost, and started seething at what he'd stolen. Not just the money, but the years of devotion, the trust, the very marrow of her identity. Still, anger alone couldn't stop the freefall. Her credit score cratered. Bill collectors circled like vultures. At the grocery store, her card was declined in front of a line of strangers. She stood frozen as the cashier announced, "Do you have another form of payment?" Her face flamed crimson, while a woman behind her sighed loudly, muttering about people who can't manage their money. Ava walked out with empty hands, her humiliation louder than the hollow growl in her stomach. At night she replayed Hadley's voice on the phone. The quiver, the sniffles, the fake grief. She replayed Connor's smile, wondering how many times he'd kissed her while thinking of escape routes. And every replay drove home the truth. Her husband hadn't died. He had vanished. Alive, rich and free, while she was left to drown in the wreckage. She started to whisper it to herself before sleep. "I wasn't a widow, I was a mark." That sentence became the pivot point. The unraveling was nearly complete, but buried under the humiliation and loss, something new began to smolder, a seed of fury, and the faintest spark of resolve. Because Ava McDowell wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. Ava McDowell's life didn't turn around in a single moment. It wasn't a movie scene with stirring music and sudden resolve. It was slower, uglier, like crawling out of mud with bloody knees. A year after Connor's disappearance, the divorce was finalized. Dissolution on grounds of abandonment. The words sounded clinical on the judge's lips, but they hit Ava's ears like a final merciful bell. The ring on her finger had already been sold to cover overdue utility bills, yet signing the papers felt heavier than wearing it. She walked out of the Jefferson County Courthouse that day with her maiden name restored. For the first time in years, the signature on the line read Ava McDowell, not tethered to Connor's stolen surname. She drove home in her rusted Honda Civic, windows cracked to let the cold February air sting her lungs. For once she welcomed the sting. It proved she was still alive. But survival required more than breathing. Roy pressed pamphlets into her hands one night at the kitchen table. Financial Literacy 101, Denver Public Library. Ava almost laughed. "Roy, I can't even afford to keep the lights on. What am I supposed to do with this?" "Start," he said simply. "You either keep being the victim of his game, or you learn to beat it." The class met Tuesday nights in a fluorescent-lit room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. Ava sat with retirees, young couples, even single parents, all scribbling notes while a volunteer banker explained basics she'd once thought beneath her credit scores: compound interest, how to spot predatory contracts. Every sentence felt like a blade carving shame into her ribs. She, the woman who let her husband manage everything, who hadn't questioned a single withdrawal, but as weeks turned into months, the shame shifted into something else. A tool, knowledge that might have saved her once, and could still protect her now. Her first victory came quietly, opening a checking account in her own name, with $300 saved from tutoring neighborhood kids after school. She slid the debit card into her wallet and whispered to herself in the parking lot, "No one can touch this but me." Therapy under Dr. Catalina Stone continued. One session in particular branded itself into Ava's bones. She confessed she still woke up expecting to hear Connor in the shower, or that she sometimes dialed his old number just to see if it rang. Catalina leaned forward. "You're mourning someone who never existed," she said gently. "You didn't lose a husband, you lost the illusion of one." That night, Ava burned the last of Connor's photographs. Not in a cinematic bonfire, but in a dented metal trash can behind the duplex she now rented. The flames curled around his smiling face, the wedding day tuxedo, the beach vacation snapshots. She stood in the smoke until her clothes reeked of it, until she finally believed she wasn't preserving memories. She was purging evidence. Career became her lifeline. She poured her grief into her classroom at Maplewood Elementary, then into night classes at University of Northern Colorado. She studied education leadership, fighting exhaustion with coffee and willpower. She stumbled, failed an exam, cried in the campus bathroom, but she retook it, passed, and pressed forward. By the time she earned her master's degree, her colleagues stood and clapped in the teacher's lounge. The principal shook her hand and said, "How does Assistant Principal McDowell sound?" Ava smiled, thin but real. For the first time, the title wasn't tied to a man. The humiliation that once gutted her began to fuel her. When she saw her credit score crawl upward after months of on-time payments, she printed the report and taped it to her fridge. When she negotiated her first car loan without a co-signer, she drove home with tears of victory stinging her eyes. In the support circle Catalina recommended, Ava found other women who had been tricked, cheated, or abandoned. They sat in folding chairs in a church basement, pouring coffee into styrofoam cups, swapping stories that sounded different yet identical. One woman's boyfriend drained her savings with fake investment tips. Another's husband fled to Arizona, with a mistress and their mortgage money. It was here Ava met Raina McLaughlin, a fellow survivor whose calm strength anchored the group. Raina squeezed Ava's hand after her first trembling testimony. "What was meant to break you," she whispered, "can build you stronger." Ava clung to those words like scripture. 8 years passed. Slowly, Ava rebuilt herself into a woman strangers described as steady, formidable, someone who's been through hell, and learned how to walk on the coals. She dressed sharply now, carried herself with quiet authority as Principal McDowell at Maplewood. But scars never truly vanish. When she locked her front door each night, she still double-checked the bolts twice. When a man complimented her in the grocery store, she smiled politely but stepped back, heart-rattling. Still, she was no longer the woman who cried into cold casseroles in a foreclosed kitchen. She was a woman who had crawled from the ashes, and somewhere deep inside, armor had begun to form. And it was that armor she would need, because fate wasn't finished with her yet. 8 years after the night she buried an empty casket, Ava McDowell would step into an airport terminal and come face to face with the ghost who had destroyed her life. Airports are strange places. For most people, they mean beginnings. Honeymoons, business trips, family reunions. For Ava McDowell, they would become the stage where the dead came back to life. It was a Friday in June, 8 years after the night she thought she'd buried her husband. Ava, now 41, had flown to LAX for a national principals conference. She carried herself with calm authority, a rolling suitcase trailing behind, her badge lanyard still swinging from her neck. The terminal buzzed with chatter, flight announcements, children laughing, the metallic clatter of rolling carts. And then one child's laughter cut through the noise like a bell Ava had heard before. She froze. Ahead, near the boarding gates, a tall man with salt and pepper hair bent down to scoop up a little boy in his arms. A woman, visibly pregnant, adjusted her cardigan as she pushed a stroller holding a baby girl, and the man, God, the man. It was Connor McDowell, her dead husband, the man she had wept for, starved for, clawed herself back to life from, standing alive, smiling, whole, carrying on like a father of the year. The world narrowed to a pinpoint. Ava's breath, locked in her chest. For one wild second, she thought maybe she was hallucinating, some cruel projection of grief. But when he turned slightly, the exact same scar nicked across his jawline, the one she remembered from a college football injury. He was real. He was alive. And he had another family. Her hand trembled as she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Years of therapy and scars steadied her fingers long enough to snap photo after photo. Connor laughing, Connor holding his daughter's tiny hand, Connor leaning down to kiss his pregnant wife's temple. Her pulse thundered in her ears. 8 years of humiliation pressed on her chest. Every foreclosure notice, every pitying look, every whispered she must have been blind. They all combusted into a single truth. He had stolen her life to build this one. Ava stepped forward. He saw her before she reached him. His face went pale, the smile cracking into raw fear. Ava. His voice was barely a whisper, panic lacing each syllable. He handed the boy back to the stroller and held his hands up as if approaching a hostage negotiator. Please. Not here. Please. Ava's voice was steady, low, cold. You're supposed to be dead. He glanced at the pregnant woman who was frowning now, confused. I can explain, Connor hissed. I had to disappear. Dangerous people were after me. I did this to protect you, to protect us. Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Protect me. You emptied our accounts, sold the house out from under me, left me to beg for groceries. You didn't protect me. You destroyed me. Connor's eyes darted wildly. Ava, please. Think of the kids. Don't make a scene. I'll meet you later, explain everything, but don't do this to them. For the first time in years, she felt taller than him, stronger. She met his gaze square. I am thinking of them, they deserve to know who their father really is. And then she did the one thing Connor never expected. She stepped back, raised her phone, and made the call. Detective Hull, this is Ava McDowell. I just found him. The color drained from Connor's face. Ava, no. Security moved fast. Within minutes, uniformed officers converged on the gate. Passengers turned to gawk as Connor tried to reason, then pleaded, then snapped. The mask slipped in real time.
This is a mistake.
You don't understand, he barked. I'm not who you think I am. The pregnant woman stood rooted in shock, clutching her children close as 2 officers cuffed him.
Ave.
Passengers murmured. Phones lifted to record. The once charming Connor McDowell was paraded down the terminal like a common criminal. Ava followed, not with rage, not with tears, but with an eerie calm. She had rehearsed this moment in her head for 8 years, never expecting it would come. As they passed one another, Connor tried once more. His voice dropped, desperate. Please, Ava, don't let them take everything. You owe me. She tilted her head, studied him like a specimen under glass, and whispered, No, Connor, you owe me. And this time you'll pay. For the first time since the night of that phone call, she felt her humiliation burn away, not into forgiveness, not yet, but into power. Because the man who had conned her, shamed her, erased her, was no longer a ghost. He was flesh and blood, caught in her grip, and now the whole world would know it. The arrest at LAX didn't just stop a fugitive, it ripped the mask off a man who had lived 2 lives, one built on lies, and another built on stolen money. By the time Connor McDowell was processed, fingerprinted and identified, the story had already broken online. Banker fakes death, builds double life abroad, exposed by widow in airport confrontation. It was everywhere: morning shows, podcasts, late-night commentary. The photos Ava had taken hit national news. Strangers online called her brave, others called her gullible. The humiliation was still there, but now it came laced with something sharper: vindication. The truth spread fast. Investigators confirmed Connor had been living under the name Thatcher Baldwin in Vancouver. He had opened a boutique investment firm with fabricated credentials, boasting of visionary strategies. The firm flourished until the walls cracked, offshore accounts were traced. Shell companies linked back to Hadley Chambers, who had staged the original 3 a.m. call. Together, Connor and Hadley hadn't just stolen from Ava, they had orchestrated a sprawling fraud that siphoned nearly $50 million from clients across 3 countries. At the trial in Denver federal court, the gallery was packed with journalists, investors, and victims. Ava sat in the second row, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry when Connor walked in, wearing a county-issued jumpsuit. She didn't flinch when his lawyers painted him as a man desperate, forced into survival mode by threats. The prosecution dismantled him piece by piece. Bank transfers, burner phones, signed deeds, the storage unit filled with gear for his disappearance. Evidence so overwhelming, Even the jurors stopped taking notes. The most devastating moment came when Connor's second wife, Noelle Baldwin, took the stand. Her voice broke as she described their 7-year marriage, how he handled every bill, every decision, how he promised safety and stability, while slowly draining her accounts too. When court recessed, Ava and Noelle met face to face in a quiet hallway. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Noelle whispered, "Did he do it to you too?" Ava nodded. Yes. In that single exchange, shame melted into solidarity. Both women realized they were chapters in the same book of lies. By verdict day, the courtroom held its breath. On all counts of wire fraud, financial conspiracy and identity falsification, we find the defendant guilty. Connor's jaw tightened. For once no words came out of his mouth. The judge's sentence was swift and merciless, 25 years in federal prison, with no parole for 15. Hadley Chambers, extradited from Zurich, turned state's witness, and received a lighter sentence, but his reputation was ashes. Ava was awarded restitution, millions in recovered assets, plus damages. Yet money was the smallest piece of her victory. Weeks later, she stood in the sterile visiting room of Florence Federal Correctional Complex. Connor shuffled in, shackled at the wrists. He tried to smile. That same charming curl of lips that once disarmed her. She didn't give him the satisfaction of anger. She looked him in the eye and said, "I forgive you, not for you but for me, because I'm not carrying you any longer." And with that, she walked out, never to return. Her life was no longer his shadow. Years that followed were not about erasing the past, but transforming it. Ava completed her doctorate in education and became principal of Maplewood Elementary. She found companionship in Emery Norton, a fellow educator who courted her with honesty instead of grand gestures. His proposal came not with a lavish display, but with a simple gold band and words that carried more weight than any diamond. "I will never lie to you." Ava wept, not from doubt, but from relief. Her wedding was small, 30 guests in a sunlit garden in Boulder. No press, no spectacle, just family, friends, and laughter that rang true. Noelle attended, her children toddling through the grass, and the two women embraced as allies, not rivals. Together, Ava and Noelle co-founded the Phoenix Circle, a support network for financial fraud survivors. What started as a handful of women in a church basement grew into a national nonprofit with hundreds of members. They shared resources, legal contacts, therapy referrals. They turned their pain into a lighthouse for others adrift in the same storm. One evening, Ava stood before a circle of new members. Her voice was steady, her eyes bright with the weight of lived truth. "Rock bottom is where you discover what you're truly made of," she told them. "The ones who try to destroy you can end up giving you your greatest strength. I thought I was a widow. I thought I was a fool, but what I really was unfinished." Applause filled the room, not polite applause, but the kind that comes from people who understand survival. In the end, Ava McDowell was no longer the humiliated wife of a con man. She was a woman who had walked through betrayal and come out the other side stronger. She had gone from widow to winner, and this time, the life she lived was hers, and hers alone.